Hey, what's up guys? Welcome to the channel once again. In this video, we will discuss the relationship between threat, vulnerability, control, and risk as they relate to cybersecurity. But before we do that, if you have not subscribed to the channel, do consider subscribing to the channel to help the channel grow. If you have subscribed already, thank you. All right, let's get into it. All right, so say you have a house, that's your asset. But then again, this house was built close to a water body, right? So in this case, the water body now becomes the threat to your house. But then you were advised to build a wall between the water body and your house in order to protect your house. And you did that, right? So the wall now becomes your control. That is going to prevent the water from overflowing to cause damage to your house. But then, assuming the wall between your house and the water, which is your control, develops a vulnerability, like a big hole in the wall. So now, this big hole in the wall, which is your control, is what we call the vulnerability. Well, having known all these risk factors, let's try to define risk in relation to or in regards to this house based on all the risk factors that we have identified. So for instance, if I'm going to define risk based on these risk factors, a risk to this house is the likelihood of the water body, which is a threat, exploiting this vulnerability, that is the hole in the wall, in our control and causing an undesirable impact to our house, which is our asset. So again, the risk to this house is the likelihood of this water body or the water overflowing its boundaries and exploiting the vulnerability. In this case, the vulnerability is the hole in the wall and causing an undesirable impact to our house. That is the asset. All right, so now if we were to define what is a threat based on this diagram, a threat will now be anything that has the potential or the tendency to cause an undesirable impact. Anything that has the tendency to cause an undesirable impact, in this case, is going to be our threat. That's how we're going to define the threat. So say if you want to define a vulnerability, the vulnerability is defined as a weakness in a control. So vulnerability is a weakness in a control that is being exploited by a threat. If you want to define an asset is simply anything of value, right? And then if you want to define what a control is an action implemented to counter a potential threat. All right, so now let's look at the individual definition of the risk factors that we have identified. So we have vulnerability. This is defined as the weakness in a control or a system, just as we saw in the previous diagram. All right. A threat, anything that is object, substance, or human that has the tendency to cause harm or destruction. Control, this is an action implemented to counter a potential threat and thus reduce a risk. Just like we saw in the diagram, the wall that was put in between the house and the water body is a form of a control. So bringing it back to computers, any of the controls that you know, like having a password on the system, before you log in, or having the lock on the door before someone enter into any secure room or a mail room or what have you, those are all forms of control that we put in place to protect an asset. So now we're going to define a risk based on all these risk factors that we have identified. It is the likelihood of a threat exploiting a vulnerability, just as we said in the beginning. In a control, right? Exploiting a vulnerability in a control or a system to cause an undesirable impact. That is the key, undesirable impact, right? So it could be any impact, right? Be it low impact, moderate impact, or high impact, any impact at all. As long as it's undesirable, it is an impact. Inherent risk, the level or the risk level or exposure without taking into account any of the actions that organization or management has taken or might take, example, implementing security control. So this inherent risk is the risk that exists by virtue of you being in a particular business or using a particular system. If you're in the banking industry, one of the inherent risks of being in the banking business is what? Theft or armed robbery. This is the risk that comes with the business. It's just that it comes with the nature of business. If you're in the transportation business, your main inherent risk will be what? Accident, right? You have to really see what happens if my drivers get into an accident and stuff like that. All right, so now residual risk. This is defined as the remaining risk after organization or after an organization has implemented a risk response, a control. So risk cannot be eliminated 100% or completely. Again, risk cannot be eliminated completely. So it means that after you have implemented controls to mitigate these identified risks, you still will be left with some risk. And this relates to the risk tolerance of an organization. So whatever risk you can tolerate within your organization is what drives the residual risk, right? So the residual risk is basically the risk that remains after you have tried to mitigate all these identified risks to an acceptable level. All right, so now moving on. The core duty of a cybersecurity professional is to identify, mitigate, and manage cyber risk to an organization's digital asset. Cybersecurity professionals must understand risk in the context of cybersecurity, which means knowing how to determine, measure, and reduce risk effectively. Assessing risk is one of the most critical functions of a cybersecurity professional. Without adequate knowledge of risk, organizations might implement overprotection or underprotection. All right, so now let's look at approaches to implementing cybersecurity program. Generally, there are three different approaches whenever you are implementing a cybersecurity program within your organization. Number one is compliance-based. This approach relies on rules and regulations or standards. Hence, controls are implemented regardless whether you like it or not. Example, FISMA, right, which is the Federal Information Security Modernization Act. That is after 2014. But prior to 2014, in 2002, when this law was enacted, it was called, or it was known as Federal Information Security Management Act. But after the modernization in 2014, the acronyms actually stays the same, but the M moved from management to Modernization Act. And we also have HIPAA, which is what? Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, right? This is for the hospital, right? Or any medical facility that keeps records of patients, right? They have to abide by these regulations to keep the patient information and record private and secure, right? All right, so moving on, we have Sarbanes-Oxley, also known as Public Company Accounting Reform and Investor Protection Act. This is what the Senate called, the Senate version of the law. This is what it's called. And then the House version of the law is called the Corporate and Auditing Accountability, Responsibility, and Transparency Act. This is most commonly known as what? SOC. And this is meant to protect the investors as they invest in this publicly traded company. All right, so moving on, we have the PCI DSS, the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard. And this is for all the businesses that use point of sales, when they accepting payment, if they're processing any payment or card payment in their transaction. These are the regulations that they must abide by. Number two, risk-based. This approach relies on identifying the unique risk a particular organization faces and designing and implementing security controls to address that risk above and beyond the entity's risk tolerance and business needs. You identify the risks within your organization or within the industry that you are, and then you implement these controls or you implement this cybersecurity program appropriately to defend or protect your asset. Moving on, we have the ad hoc. This approach simply implements security with no particular rationale or criteria. It means ad hoc implementation may be driven by vendor marketing, or they may reflect insufficient subject matter expertise, knowledge, and training. When designing and implementing safeguard, they just copy approaches from other companies. You don't have any rationale. You will just copying what what other companies are doing. This is a very bad approach to implementing cybersecurity. You might be lucky and you might nail it. You might meet all your security requirements, but sometimes you might be off. So the best two are the compliance base and then the risk base. So the risk base, you look at your industry. If you're in the banking industry, obviously the risk there is quite different than somebody who is in the entertainment business, right? So definitely you have to look at what controls need to be implemented for someone that is in the banking industry, and what control needs to be implemented for someone that is in the retail industry. All right, guys, that's it for this short video. If you find this video helpful, do like, share, and subscribe if you have not subscribed already. Thank you if you have subscribed. Do comment below and let me know your thought on this video. All right, I'll see you again in the next video. Peace out.